June 11th, 2020. That was a day I'm sure meant many different things for gamers, as they awaited for what Sony had to present to them in their future gaming livestream showcase. It was the day for the supposed PlayStation 5 console to unveil itself and deliver on the promises and expectations that had been built up months prior, from the simple reveal of a logo to other strides forward in knowing what we were in for, like when the system's lead architect, Mark Cerny, stepped up to present what they aimed to achieve with the development of their 9th generation console. Whether if you were there looking out for certain developers, or just curious to see what the fuss was all about, I'm sure there was that one, or maybe even a multitude of things, that popped out to every single individual watching that showcase that day. Regardless of what you were there for that day, all developers contributing to this new generation all had one message to share.
Welcome to PlayStation 5.
And while I did have a few games that caught my eye during that presentation, the thing that admittedly persisted through my mind at the time was, my PS4 still works pretty well, probably won't need a PS5 for a while, but as soon as that familiar lombax and robot duo plopped out from a portal and onto a luscious green planet brimming with life, that's the moment that made me go, oh, now I need to get me a PlayStation 5 pronto. Though again, I gotta admit that I didn't aim to buy it at launch since I wanted to wait until the game's release date came closer. That and I was still out of work due to the pandemic, and couldn't prioritize buying expensive electronics like this, on top of scalpers making things harder, but I digress. Anyway, it just blew my mind how fantastic the game looked, even if what I saw at the time was a pre-alpha build. Never would I have thought since I last saw them back on the PlayStation 3 in 2013 with Into the Nexus, and the PlayStation 4 with the 2016 reboot of the first game, that they could look even better than they did before. And to also think as well that we hadn't seen nothing yet back in 2007 when we were raving over and praising Insomniac Games for creating a video game matching the level of quality an animated Pixar production can attain. If that's what we thought back then I probably wouldn't have imagined that we push our boundaries even further. And the reveal material I mentioned being the pre-alpha build of the game, well, it's safe to say that the final product looked even better. But video games are more than just the visuals they put out. At the end of the day, they're made to be played, so of course, they have to be fun and engaging in their own rights. As a longtime fan of Ratchet Clank, no thanks to a couple of friends showing it to me on their PS2 with Going Commando way back when, since we had other common interests at the time, I'd say I knew what I was in for with this new Ratchet Clank entry, even before they showed their gameplay with that ever so familiar Omni Wrench, along with an assortment of weapons at Ratchet's disposal, combined with his maneuverability across the playspace. Though that didn't mean that Insomniac Games had no surprises to offer, as they aimed to take advantage of the new hardware's capabilities, tailoring their focus on a collapsing universe with dimensional chaos ensuing wildly, influencing both the playspace you interact with and even the characters we've come to know in this universe, and so much more to the point where, well, let's just say fan art was in no short supply after Rift Apart's reveal. On the note of what I once knew in the characters as well, the fact that Rift Apart was serving as a simultaneous continuation of Ratchet Clank Into the Nexus and the 2016 reboot was something that excited me even more, though mostly for the former rather than the latter. Seeing Ratchet Clank back then with Going Commando was awesome, but having a continuation beyond the future saga's epilogue was what excited me the most, since I think back to that saga with a certain fondness, with the story they told. And it just so happened that with everything Insomniac Games was putting on the table with Rift Apart, anyone can go into this game regardless of if they know everything or nothing about this franchise, though it is admittedly a nice bonus to have a connection to Ratchet & Clank's past. So taking all this into account, it's fair to say that there was a lot to look forward to with this new installment for the Ratchet & Clank series, and my expectations seem pretty high. So it's time to discuss whether or not the year-long wait and the desire to evade the scalpers proved to meet said expectations, or if everything I'd hoped for came crashing down, leaving me to squabble in my own disappointment of both the game and console it was built for. Before we get into the newer things this interdimensional tale provides us, I'd say it's appropriate to brush up on tradition for this series' gameplay formula and the structure that a Ratchet & Clank game is built upon. The very structure I know and love, and the reason I came back for more things Ratchet & Clank today. The best place to start would be Ratchet's signature tool, the Omni Wrench, being quite practical for use in combat, while being quite useful for helping with progression in tasks like turning bolt cranks and hitting Blazon crystals to transform specific play areas you're in, if available, and breaking crates to accumulate lots and lots of bolts, along with replenishing your health and ammunition. The Omni Wrench still remains an acceptable alternative to Ratchet's extensive arsenal of weapons, as he can slam down the wrench onto his opponents and toss it like a boomerang if need be. And for our newly debuting lombax, Rivet, the gameplay feel with her hammer remains identical to Ratchet and his Omni Wrench. That being said, if you were expecting any minor differences in gameplay similar to what we've seen in Insomniac's incarnation of Peter Parker and Miles Morales in their respective Spider-Man PlayStation titles, then that's not what you're going to find here in Rift Apart between Ratchet and Rivet. Well, unless if you count a minor change in the heads-up display's color palette when playing as either character. Though it's not necessarily a bad thing, mind you. It sort of speaks to what this game was going for with who Ratchet and Rivet are in relation to one another. Both lombaxes share each other's respective skill set, but remain unique from one another since both of their dimensions and how things turned out for each of them remain drastically different. Expanding on the topic of our protagonist's skill sets, as they share the same weapon wheel, are the weapons they wield along with their maneuverability. Ever since Ratchet & Clank Going Commando back in 2003, changed up things forever as it introduced proper strafe running to the series' already fun run-and-gun platforming gameplay style. It, along with weapon upgrades you purchased with Raritanium you collected both your first and even your second playthrough, have remained a constant to this very day, with each unique addition in the Ratchet & Clank armory. And don't worry, I haven't forgotten that the first game technically did the whole stronger variant aspect of Ratchet's weapons first. Anyway, coming back to Rift Apart, there's no need to worry about if you have to track between different weapon levels or even bolt counts between Ratchet and Rivet. I'm grateful for Insomniac Games thinking of that since it probably would have been a pain in the ass for myself as a player, and from what I can assume anyway, on the production side in the same game too possibly. Everything remains interconnected every time you play as each character, and there are certain places or events only Ratchet and Rivet can respectively access and complete. Either way, each weapon's progression will carry over to the other, and regardless of what you choose to do, and how much you want to do as Ratchet or Rivet, be it how many detours you wish to take on each planet for side missions and collectibles, and how much you use each gun, that call is ultimately up to you. Some weapons such as the Burst Pistol, Buzz Blades, Shatter Bomb, Glove of Doom, Warmonger, and Rhino, the 8th edition this time, will feel very familiar to a fan like myself, but Rift Apart had room to try and experiment with other kinds of weapon types as well, which I really appreciated. Though I gotta say that I was really entertained by the Lightning Rod. I kinda do miss weapons like the Groovatron that was featured in the Future Saga games along with the 2016 reboot, but oh well, it's not that big of a deal. The weapons are still fun anyway, and at least we have Rivet dancing at Xerxes to compensate. Oh, and I almost forgot. Since we're now on the PlayStation 5 and Insomniac did put a bit of emphasis on this feature before launch, I really like the implementation of the adaptive triggers on the guns. And trust me on this, it took a little getting used to adaptive triggers when I first got my PS5 and tried it out for myself. I wasn't too crazy about using that feature on my DualSense controller at first, since I thought it was disruptive compared to what I used on the DualShock 4. It was able to grow on me over time, and now, I can't really see myself playing any other future PS5 release without the feature as a result. And even now, I still keep it on and use it whenever I can. With Rift Apart, I loved how effective it was in drawing a player like myself into the immersion of what's happening on screen. You know, besides the gorgeous looking environments. Side note, but I'm kind of a sucker for the color purple, so the ruptured version of Blizzard Prime really did it for me in this game. And it did sort of take me back to Into the Nexus a bit, using those gravity boots to lock on and stick yourself onto floating space debris as you shoot back at your enemies. Good times. Anyway, going back on track here, I'm gonna sound like a bit of a parrot to one of the devs, but a great use of the adaptive triggers that I enjoyed using was the Enforcer. You, the player, can have a bit of leeway with how the weapon fires, depending on how much force you put on the DualSense's R2 button. The game will know that you want to fire one of the Enforcer's shots by holding down the R2 button with a partial amount of pressure, but when you put more pressure on the button, it'll fire both shots out of both barrels as you move about the playspace. Or in the burst pistol's case, holding down the R2 button halfway will fire small bursts from the gun if need be, while holding it down all the way will unleash a deadly barrage of automatic fire when the situation calls for it. Moving on here as we continue discussing the maneuverability aspect of this game, I wanted to continue the discussion of Ratchet & Clank's fun run-and-gun platforming gameplay by bringing to light a couple of Ratchet & Rivet's new moves and means of traversal, along with a returning classic one may recognize from before: the Phantom Dash, Rift Tether, Hurl Shot, Speedles, and hover boots. Phantom Dash goes hand in hand with the strafe running quite well, as it can allow you to phase through enemy attacks and is quite the effective alternative to simply jumping side to side across the playspace. Along with its implementation in combat is its usefulness in accessing certain areas of the playspace, be it wall panels Ratchet can run across, blocked off electronic barriers that can be phased through, and just in case you need that extra push, it allows for greater lengths to be reached. Though, keep in mind, you can't phase through everything. Speaking of reaching greater lengths and extra pushes, the Rift Tether, with a function similar to that of the classic swing shot, and even that still remains in this game in some parts. The Rift Tether allows for certain areas to be reached via glowing dimensional rifts set up around the playspace. If need be, a player can use these rifts to their advantage, even in combat, to evade their enemies and stay on the move as they fire, which to me is what the Ratchet & Clank gameplay formula is all about. There's no time for standstill face-offs, and the Rift Tether is a great addition for that opportunity to move across the playspace rapidly, simultaneously allowing you to take a different position as you evade your enemy's attacks and strike them from a different angle, be it further away or up close. And of course, I need not forget that the Rift Tether is essential for Ratchet and Rivet to access optional pocket dimensions, which serve as miniature platforming challenges with an enemy or two thrown on top of that for good measure. At the end of these challenges typically lies a customizable outfit part, for those that like to partake in customizing Ratchet or Rivet if the default outfit doesn't do it for you. Now, the third item I mentioned, the Hurl Shot, serves as another expansion of the swing shot functionality. A bit harsh on the spine, but unlike the swing shot that clamps onto an orb and allows for the player to swing across and jump, the Hurl Shot allows for a way to catapult them across far distances to reach certain hard-to-reach areas, untraversable by any other means. In terms of traversing landscapes comes our fourth and second last means of traversal I wish to speak on, the Speedle.
Okay, here we go. Focus. Speed. I am speed.
As implied by the name and the really old Disney Pixar meme I just played. Speedles are a very swift and safe way to get across certain areas of certain planets that have them. In the case of a planet like Sargasso, which contains many bodies of acidic swamp water, deadly to any other organism that could come into close contact with them, it's a safe way to get across without inducing harm on the one riding the Speedle, whether if they choose to keep themselves at a certain pace, or just let loose and crank up that speed to get the most out of its abilities. And finally, last but not least, a personal favorite of mine, the hover boots. They may not be cadence hover boots, but they're still functional all the same in the capable hands, or is it feet, of Ratchet and Rivet. Similar to what I just spoke on regarding controlling the acceleration of the Speedle, the hover boots possess a couple of thrusters that gain momentum and can be charged up by pushing the R2 button or coming across little speed panels, thus resulting in another really quick and easy way to get around, especially on a planet like Savali, where there almost seems to be a heavy focus on its usage to get to certain artifacts like the Lord. And just like Ratchet & Clank A Crack in Time, its gliding functionality serves as an alternative to the classic helipack installed in Clank. I mean, what can I really say? The hover boots were great to use back then in 2009, and they're just as great to use now. And I'll even say this again, especially with the adaptive triggers. Before we wrap up discussing the gameplay, I know I've spoken on what the main characters can do and what they have, but it wouldn't be a Ratchet & Clank game if we didn't have other additional puzzle levels, with Clank mainly heading the responsibility, along with a few other surprise characters. Clank throughout the series has always been about going into small places that Ratchet can't get to, or upholding responsibilities that, unknown to him prior to taking them on, he was built for that exact purpose, to do those exact tasks, regardless of if Clank wanted to continue with those responsibilities or choose a different path. This time around, Clank takes on the responsibility of fixing dimensional anomalies encountered throughout the game. The goal is somewhat reminiscent of those temporal recording puzzles back in A Crack in Time, except We don't have access to a chronoceptor, but rather different types of orbs to place in the right spot, in order to lead Clank's possibilities to the gateway in order to continue progression. And as the game goes on, the puzzles become slightly more difficult for the former robot Time Guardian. With some time away from Clank, there's been a new opportunity for another character, besides the other obvious major one, to step in and aid Ratchet on his journey. Meet Glitch, a tiny and admittedly adorable computerized spider that infiltrates virus-ridden computer terminals and clears them out so they may be unlocked for Ratchet. Naturally, this involves many hacking missions. Some are more mandatory than others to do, but all in all, there's not much to say. You go in, break some barriers, shoot down virus nests and clusters with your guns along with some upgrades, and you get out, so Ratchet can continue his endeavors. Though, it is admittedly still kind of fun though. It's something different to take a break from the main action, without it being too disruptive or having me think, I gotta do this part. Great. To me at least. It's almost very Sly Cooper in that way. Yeah. Well, I believe I covered as many things as I could in Rift Apart's gameplay, so now it's time to dive into what Insomniac wrote as a continuation of the Ratchet & Clank series, picking up from where we left off all the way back in 2013, 2 generations prior. After Ratchet and Clank were able to drive off the Nethers and their evil leader, Mr. I, back to the Netherverse with the help of other supporting characters like Captain Quark, along with the game's antagonists, Vendra and Nefton Prague. What's left of Into the Nexus's conclusion is a broken Dimensionator, the very thing that shifted Ratchet's journey at times since Tools of Destruction. With Vendra and Nefton rectifying their past mistakes, they turned themselves in to the hands of the authorities, as per Ratchet's deal, for what they had done in their evil schemes, after everything was made right again. When we all thought this chapter of the story was closed, and Ratchet's desire to even think about attempting to find the lombaxes again was quelled, as he claimed that he had more where he was, versus whatever he may find out there with the lombaxes. To the surprise of many, Clank grabs the dysfunctional Dimensionator, believing it to still be of use. What he wanted or needed the Dimensionator for beyond the future saga's conclusion, we could only speculate over these past 8 years. Pausing on Ratchet and Clank's story for just a moment, while simultaneously jumping to the present, Rift Apart's opening introduces us to a neon-lit, dystopian-looking, urbanized environment, with things supposedly functioning as per normal, or as normal as things can get in this dark-looking new world. Among the robotic citizens walking about and minding their own business, another one of those supposed robotic citizens, totally not a squishy rebel lombax dressed to look like one, emerges from a manhole as a person over a radio transmission and guides them on their mission to steal an infobot. While this individual in the disguise does admittedly take a chance to make a break for it, as their foes attempt to home in on their location, they still don't shy away from an opportunity to step in and help another in peril that couldn't defend themselves otherwise. After things are in the clear, we're finally introduced to a new face of the Ratchet & Clank franchise, Rivet, as she makes a break for it again after assisting the helpless young bystander, with all enemy forces beginning to close in on her. Before we're able to see what befalls our new protagonist, we're back once again with our familiar duo in their home dimension, in the city of Megalopolis, getting ready to greet a large crowd waiting for them, regardless of whether or not Ratchet believes their past heroics are worth celebrating. As the door opens up for the galaxy's beloved duo, Captain Quark, Skid McMarks, and Rusty Pete give a warm welcome to Ratchet and Clank as they make their way through the middle of the applauding crowd and make their way towards the Festival of Heroes. Things go quite well at first, as Ratchet smiles and waves to the galaxy, setting off fireworks and streamers for show with his wrench, along with an obtainable burst pistol, as he makes his way through the parade props that depict his humble beginnings. To the annoyance of Ratchet, however, a loud cheering crowd isn't the only thing he attracts attention from that day. Remember that old Thugs for Less faction that stuck around throughout the series ever since going commando all those years ago? Well, now they've taken it upon themselves to rebrand as Goons for Less. So, they begin to mix in with the festivities a bit, albeit in an unwelcome fashion. For the remainder of the festival, As Ratchet makes his way through each obstacle, we're still going through Ratchet and Clank's previous stories, like when they first met on Velden, mixed in with other acknowledgements like the giant balloon of Big Al. Gotta give credit to where credit's due, since if not for him all those years ago, Clank wouldn't have gotten a helipack upgrade. For some, if Rift Apart is their first Ratchet and Clank game, then this will be the first time they'll be introduced to those beginnings, had they not played the original 2002 release or the 2016 reboot. And the same goes for other recounts of past events like the Great Clock section of the parade. For someone like myself, seeing it included in the parade inflicts a warm feeling of nostalgia, mixed in with a tiny bit of sadness, since I remember what occurred as a result of the conclusion of A Crack in Time. Regardless of if you're familiar or not with the past, not only does the parade section serve as a nice little recap as if Insomniac Games were celebrating their history alongside the fans, but it also serves as a way to get used to the basics of the gameplay, which are elements that I described a section prior in this video. Finally reaching the end of the parade, finally caught up on the past and preparing to make haste for the future, Clank quickly runs through his speech for the galaxy and his best friend to hear, while bestowing Ratchet a gift, that Dimensionator you may or may not have pondered on for the past 8 years since Into the Nexus's conclusion. Well, Clank's been able to fix and rebuild it for Ratchet, so he may have the opportunity once again to travel through the multiverse and find the lombaxes. Though, unlike its headwear design from before, Clank has been able to convert it into a gun of sorts. Ratchet admittedly is surprised and taken back by this gift, but before he could even decide what to do, a familiar face that's canonically been absent since Ratchet and Clank All for One finally comes out to reveal himself and steal the Dimensionator. And after things continue to get a bit hectic, as a chase against Dr. Nefarious ensues, followed by yet another battle with him, just like old times. This is where things really begin to get going for Rift Apart's story, as a hasty shot results in the Dimensionator's first stage of its malfunctioning, and it was only about to get worse, as Dr. Nefarious makes an attempt to jump dimensions, preferably one where he reigns triumphant instead of Ratchet and Clank. Due to the damage the Dimensionator had taken, the fabrics holding each dimension together, while keeping them separate from one another, begun to unravel and break apart at the seams, eventually resulting in Ratchet, Clank, and Nefarious being pulled into the vortex and into the unknown reaches of the multiverse, all into the Spider-Verse-like. Where the three eventually land together was initially not a concern for any of them in the moment, but with no choice but to stick around for a little bit, since neither of them will be going home anytime soon. They all soon discover at their own pace that they've landed in a universe where Dr. Nefarious rules over everything as an emperor to this galaxy. Needless to say, one of them was pretty happy to land here. One could even say after all this time, since he's even wanted this ever since his run-ins with Ratchet and Clank concerning the Great Clock. He's finally found a present where the heroes have always suffered defeat, but his villainous streak remained undefeated in the appropriately named Nefarious City. And, needless to say, Dr. Nefarious, after enduring so many defeats over the years, was more than thrilled to settle into what he believed was his rightful seat as Emperor, and bask in the joys of finally attaining victory as a supervillain. And for once, he can do it without suffering any humiliating freeze-ups that result in his head playing back portions of a certain soap opera. With Nefarious at the top, curiously rummaging through the functionalities of all his resources as Emperor, Ratchet and Clank, respectively, find themselves at the bottom in this new universe, separated from one another. The giant rupture caused by the Dimensionator's destruction hadn't gone unnoticed, thus bringing a skeptical Rivet into the picture, as she comes across Clank missing an arm. So at this point, we've got all the foundations of the story laid down. The unraveling of the dimension's boundaries, our new dimension belonging to Nefarious, Ratchet and Clank being separated, and now Rivet actively getting involved as she first encounters Clank, who would be the connection she'd need to understand who Ratchet and Dr. Nefarious are. It'll take some time for every one of these characters to cross paths among their separate journeys, but for now, each of them all have their own paths to follow, whether if it's Ratchet learning about how much a grip Emperor Nefarious's rule truly has on Nefarious City and the rest of the galaxy, along with those attempting to resist said rule, or Rivet yearning to discover the truth on her own terms regarding Clank's claims about the Dimensionator being the cause of what's happening around her universe. Oh, and did I mention that there will also be other alternate universe versions of beloved past Ratchet and Clank characters popping up here and there, to which the set of 3 popping up in the parade braces us for. And I need not forget about Mrs. Zircon in Rivet's dimension, since she radiates this cheerful energy, while the one in Ratchet's dimension that we see only twice purposefully sounds flatter and more robotic. And as I'll reiterate, if you're not familiar with past games or these characters, then meeting their dimensional counterparts are a great way to be introduced to them, since it feels like meeting someone new for the first time, even for me despite knowing certain characters for a certain amount of time over the years. And this same mindset can be applied to our new heroine as well as other planets we visit in this game, some serving as alternate dimension counterparts to planets from past games, while others are planets we've never visited. It all mixes together as Ratchet will encounter Rivet's enemies from time to time in her dimension, and Rivet will deal with Ratchet's enemies that crossed over from his dimension. Speaking of which, let's jump back to Rivet's story and fast forward a bit to Sargasso. She may have always been alone and without a partner since, unlike Ratchet, she was a bit more reserved and skeptical about robots. But just like Ratchet, if you want to count the 2016 reboot with Grim on Velden, Rivet grew up on Sargasso with the Morts, and shares a great relations with them. If Insomniac Games wanted a longtime fan like myself to notice these things, or put 2 and 2 together, then I'd say they did a pretty good job with delivering that sense of familiarity, while making sure to keep me immersed in this news story. There is one other thing I hadn't really spoken on, Mark Mothersbaugh being the composer of this game. I hadn't thought much of it, though the game's soundtrack does effectively capture the distinct feel of each location visited, but Mark Mothersbaugh is a name that I hadn't realized I was familiar with, and this has been gnawing at me ever since the State of Play back in late April. I don't know if I'm crazy, but I'm just gonna play 2 tracks for you. Well, Naughty Dog, or whoever out there would care to make another Jak and Daxter game, Mark Mothersbaugh would be perfect to bring back since he had that magic for that trilogy, and he definitely still has the magic to compose video game music today with Rift Apart. Small nostalgic soundtrack comparison tangent aside, Sargasso is the place leading up to the next big steps. That's to be expected. Building up the small steps towards reuniting Ratchet and Clank, having Rivet learn of Ratchet's existence, so she may eventually get the opportunity to speak to him, Clank taking on a new task as he first steps into a dimensional anomaly, and getting airborne, with the help of the Morts, to travel through space again, so that all of that may be possible as they work towards stopping Nefarious. It may not be the classic ambient PlayStation 2 loading screen, since I dug the sound of the thrusters on Ratchet's ship soaring through space, but things are a little bit quicker when it comes to loading into the planet, and there's plenty to go around as each planet offers unique hazards, enemies, features, and visuals, as they're all presented uniquely, while maintaining a connection to the overarching narrative of the slow dimensional collapse. What's able to ensue next after taking part in some arena fights against Rusty Pete's dimensional counterpart, Pierre Lafer, or rather his own troops fighting for him, is that next step being taken as the signal booster she was able to win from the dramatic robot pirate allows for Clank to call for Ratchet. This particular scene always brings a warm smile to my face, as Ratchet and Rivet first speak to one another. Sure, they talk about the problems they're facing as they agree to split up the tasks, working towards their objective to rebuild the Dimensionator. But that didn't mean there wasn't any room for anything lighthearted in this scene. From Ratchet's relief of his best friend being okay, to Ratchet and Rivet mirroring one another as they inadvertently copy each other's phrases, as if sharing a brain cell. Doesn't seem too surprising of an occurrence as they believe they're dimensional counterparts of one another. It doesn't take too long for us, the audience, to realize that we need to skedaddle, and quickly, if we were to beat Nefarious at his own game, in a dimension that praised him like a god, thus concluding this scene as player choice takes over with planet selection, with Rivet and Clank needing to procure the heart of the Dimensionator through the phase quartz she needs to power it, while Ratchet handles the construction of the body that holds it all together. And to note as well, Zurkie's arena is something that you can definitely take advantage of, though only Rivet can enter the arenas in this game. The only time we ever technically see Ratchet in there, if this can even count, is through the Mrs. Zircon weapon previews you can view before you decide to make your purchase. For all intents and purposes, while both Ratchet and Rivet respectfully have unique moments to themselves, both before and after they work towards meeting one another as they gather their respective parts for the Dimensionator, I'm gonna direct my focus back to Ratchet momentarily as he makes his way to Savali. Initially, he may be without his longtime robotic companion he's cherished since the early days, but with this game staying true to its nature, dimensional counterparts allow for a first-time meeting for both Ratchet and the audience alike, with the introduction of KT-7461, or as she's commonly known later as, thanks to Ratchet's suggestion for a more personable nickname, Kit. Herself alongside her teacher, Gary, and the other monks that reside on this planet have dedicated their lives to the protection and preservation of ancient lombax knowledge still kept within the planet's soil, along with the interdimensional archives containing irreplaceable documentation like a dimensional map. A stark contrast to their more abrasive goons for less mercenary relatives. As for the rest of the ancient knowledge scattered around the planet's wide open plains, well, those lorbs, as the game calls them, contains pieces of information such as why the Dimensionator was initially found as a helmet and tools of destruction, along with certain acknowledgements that I believe are special enough to play back.
Mapped my first dimension today. Pretty standard stuff, except the colors there were so vivid, like, whoa. And there were these creatures. One of them even looked like a lombax, but he had smaller ears, a mask, and a cane, and I think he was pulling some kind of heist? Whatever it was, it looked cool. I know I was going to stop doing these recordings, but I can carve out some time every once in a while. I'm a genius. Dimension 31x7, not super different from home, but there were these creatures. One was firing a gun and spinning himself around every other second, while the other hung out on his shoulder doing live commentary. Oh, I wanted to hang out with them so badly.
Even if these recordings are only going to serve as Easter eggs, I'd still love to believe that we'll see Jak and Daxter or Sly Cooper again. Hell, I wouldn't mind if down the road they keep the canonization of their universes existing parallel to Ratchet's via alternate dimensions. After all, if they could cross over in a game together once, then I can only hold out hope that it can happen again, even if it's brief, though I would like it to happen longer than a few seconds. So now the question remains, who is this guy? Well, it seems that this Lombax who left behind all 12 of these lore recordings was a Lombax who went by the name Mags. He was the one responsible for the Dimensionator's redesign that fits as a helmet, the very design we saw from Tools of Destruction and Into the Nexus. He did this for the sake of serving Ratchet's father, Caden, along with the Lombax Council. So it turns out that the Dimensionator that Clank rebuilt after Into the Nexus's conclusion was indeed how the Dimensionator was always supposed to look like. While Mags had many dimensions he explored, and was so eager to learn about and return to, turns out back then that time was ticking, and Mags' time to explore these dimensions further were cut short. He finished the dimensional map that Ratchet and Kit eventually access in the interdimensional archives, but by the time Mags finished his work, according to Caden, it was time to go. Time for the Lombaxes to leave so that, thanks to Mags' map, they could hide themselves in a safe dimension. And as somebody who was familiar with the Future Saga, Caden's urgency to push Mags' progress was due to Emperor Tachyon's deed he'd eventually commit. So all of this being said, not only was it another nice way to redirect my attention to the past, but Savali's Lorbs gives me something to look forward to in the future, assuming Insomniac Games are up to making another Ratchet and Clank game down the road. Whether or not we'll run into Mags, or if I'll even get my wish of seeing Jak and Daxter or Sly Cooper again, in some capacity. Even if it is a crossover, I can just keep guessing and hoping. But until that day comes, if it does, let's return to Ratchet and Kit's initial time together once more. One would think that with Kit serving as a dimensional counterpart to Clank, she'd be destined to have a partnership and friendship with Rivet. But unlike Clank, she wasn't a defective warbot, and she did her job a little too well, eventually developing a sense of remorse for what she'd done while serving under Nefarious' empire. She came to Savali hoping to isolate herself from the universe so she may never harm anyone ever again. With Ratchet's perspective, he's able to slowly, but surely, despite Kit's insistence of her refusal to maintain a partnership so she can begin to believe in herself, and step back out into the galaxy to help Ratchet fight both Nefariouses, to which she adequately does during their time together, such as when she backs up Ratchet on Kadaro Station when they attempt to build the Dimensionator. And it's kinda nice to see a bit of banter go on among the two, almost showing how Kit has become more trustworthy of Ratchet. Meanwhile, with Rivet and Clank, they continue to share a friendly connection with one another that's been able to blossom further after she found out the truth from Clank's memory banks on Sargasso, working towards collecting the phase quartz needed to make the Dimensionator function. They too have their own unique situations that they get themselves into, and since she trusts Clank now, and I'd imagine that Rivet would hate to return Clank to Ratchet all torn apart, she'd do anything to protect him, even if it meant pushing back the mission they were striving to complete. Thankfully, Rivet's knowledge of her dimension serves as a great convenience for their journey, since after their ventures on Vlizar Prime, Rivet believes there's a chance to take the shattered phase quartz to a giant robot called the Fixer, so he can do what he does as implied by his name. During Torin 4's heart-pumping grind boot sections, after they're able to reboot the Fixer, emerges an important and intriguing theme that not only applies to Clank himself, but other characters also. In his distress, while the locals did something for assistance in dealing with the pirate raids, crushing them after a while gave the Fixer a large dosage of cynicism and a loss of hope as he continued to commit these deeds, deeming himself and everything around him to be broken. Despite his observation of Clank being broken due to his missing arm, Clank believes otherwise, as he proclaims to the distressed Fixer that he is indeed fixed. He may have lost a part of himself, but that doesn't mean that he believes in himself or his mission any less, nor is he less than capable of the task at hand, despite the burdens. I think another thing contributing to Clank's proclamation besides a quick need to improvise is the dimensional anomalies that he's been looking into and fixing himself. His soul, I guess, depicts Clank and his possibilities within the anomaly to be fully intact, which I think has to do with how Clank sees himself. He hasn't lost hope and still believes in himself. A lost arm won't sway him from changing who he is and what he must do to fix the dimensions. With this being enough to dissuade the Fixer from his destructive rampage, he lives up to his reputation as he beams together the shattered phase quartz for them. Now they can finally put together the Dimensionator, or at least that's how I played the game since I did Ratchet's part of the story first, then I did Rivet's. But it all comes down to the same inevitable event and meetup that made me smile even more than when they first communicated with one another earlier in the game. One Rivet was admittedly quite nervous about since this will be the first time she's meeting another lombax in person, one who may well be her dimensional counterpart, in addition to the robot that may well be Clank's, someone that she may have been destined to partner up with. And to her and Ratchet's surprise, another first for Rivet comes up as they enter Xerxes with the Dimensionator parts in hand. For myself, I've seen and fought Dr. Nefarious many times over the years, throughout many games, as Ratchet since Up Your Arsenal, including Rift Apart's beginning. But this will not only be the first time that Rivet will fight Dr. Nefarious, and not the Emperor that she knows, but it will also be the first time she will earn a victory against the evil she's been surviving from. Not only that, but it's her first major moment that she shares with her destined partner, Kit. Despite Dr. Nefarious' defeat, however, the evils that Rivet and Kit were familiar with in their own dimension still existed, and Dr. Nefarious was just another addition of that evil brought over from Ratchet's dimension. I never really gave this much thought when I first played this game back in June, but it's interesting how Emperor Nefarious' color scheme is mainly orange, Ratchet's colors, and this is his dimension, where he always wins, and Rivet shares the color purple with Dr. Nefarious since he comes from a dimension where he's lost constantly over the years. With this in mind, one can say that this is also tied to the opposite nature of Ratchet and Rivet's dimensions respectively, as Emperor Nefarious thinks of himself as the protagonist of his own story, who has risen to the very top, while Rivet was always struggling to fight back and win against him, since she didn't share the fortune Ratchet had in his battles against Dr. Nefarious back home. At any rate, since this version of Nefarious has explicitly now entered the picture, this concludes the previous stage that entailed building the Dimensionator and having both lombaxes and robot companions meeting up, thus beginning a new stage in the story, focused on stopping both Nefariouses from dooming the universe further, and concluding the story that began when the Dimensionator came back into the picture. On the way there, while we see the two Nefariouses collaborating with one another, there's been room made to further progress the main character's development, along with a few surprises from Dr. Nefarious himself, though I will admit, the Emperor too has his moments, which include some moments of intrigue, despite my preference being geared towards Armin Shimmerman's version of Nefarious. Robin Atkin Downes' portrayal of his counterpart is still quite entertaining in his own way too, especially when this new version of Nefarious puts Dr. Nefarious under a new light, as he's in the presence of a seemingly better, more capable version of himself, cowering and begging to work for him rather than against him. Dr. Nefarious, to his relief and yet much to his dismay at times, gets that privilege. Yes, they stand together against the protagonist so that with their powers combined, they'd have a better chance of eradicating the rebellion that threatened their empire. But our beloved Dr. Nefarious is thrown around like a little brother he considers inferior. I would say that now Nefarious knows what it feels like to be his old servant Lawrence, but in truth, I'd be heavily incorrect since it puts into perspective how tantalizing Emperor Nefarious can be when it comes to taking advantage of others in addition to breaking them down, so that when he's done with them, they're convinced they're nothing without him, thus resulting in them clinging onto him for dear life. That same level of will, assertiveness, and cruelty is something that the good doctor lacked, despite being a supervillain, especially displayed by a simple mention of his assistant being given paid paternity leave, something that the all-powerful Emperor would never do, since his servants seem to work long periods of time, with very short breaks serving their emperor. There is, however, one major thing that Dr. Nefarious possessed that Emperor Nefarious would never grasp onto, and that's a sense of self-awareness, and a surprising dose of wisdom that manifested as a result of his many losses over the years against Ratchet and Clank. Having spent time with his counterpart, and seeing how much he has in addition to seeing all that he's won, the Emperor feels that his conquest made him feel unfulfilled, and Dr. Nefarious knows exactly why, and is unafraid to answer that question of why this level of success made him feel no different from before. Being a supervillain that's lost so many more times than he could count, he was naturally ecstatic to have ended up in the universe where he was successful and everyone worshipped him. He gotten what he wanted, but watching himself closer made him realize the repercussions of that consistent winning streak, resulting in that dreadful feeling of unfulfillment, in addition to a hunger for more. Something Dr. Nefarious himself faced in the past when he possessed large ambitions for creating a new present with the Great Clock in a crack in time. He now sees what he could have become had things gone a certain way, though, unfortunately for him, his pleas to his counterpart, almost as if Nefarious was bracing his conscience more, goes unheard, as Emperor Nefarious would continue to wield the Dimensionator recklessly, even if Dr. Nefarious would warn him not to do that very thing, since it'd later result in interesting living creatures to manifest. That aside, the chase is what gave Dr. Nefarious purpose in his life, and no matter how many times he was knocked down, he gets back up to try again, regardless of his past failures or if he fears failure that time again. Up to this point, I wholeheartedly appreciated Rift Apart and the story they were telling, but this perspective coming from Dr. Nefarious not only really surprised me, but it just so happens to heavily resonate with me. Not as a villain that wants to take over everything, mind you, but I think the lens that theme provides can relate to my endeavors as a content creator and the success, in air quotes, I've been trying to chase for years. Sometimes I still sit down and reflect a lot on what's happened these past few years. I've been guilty of yearning for a past opportunity in one other certain community as a YouTuber because I felt that my window of opportunity had closed, and I thought that due to being unable to fulfill what I set out to do then, I was a failure. Despite those setbacks, however, I've come to not only make peace with myself over time and try again, as I endeavor to never give this dream up. On the road of reclaiming that determination and sense of self-worth, I've also questioned something somewhat similar in a sense where I asked myself, if everything went according to plan, what would my channel and I have been like? Would I have been better off? Worse? Would my reputation be good or bad? Would I have known the people I've known today or done the things that I've done? Hell, would I even be talking about this particular topic in this specific review? Questions and reflections aside, one thing remains crystal clear for me. There is no returning to the past for a do-over, and perhaps those initial setbacks were opportunities for me to reevaluate myself and learn, so I could give myself a new opportunity to grow in a different way than I'd previously thought. All that remains is the future, and it's up to me to shape it through my present and future actions, and my ability to adjust to all that's occurring around me. I won't give up, and I will not stop. That's a takeaway from Nefarious that made me love the story even more, and that's actually a takeaway that would become a very fitting statement for the protagonist as well. For Ratchet, while he explores Ardolis in search of Pierre Lafer and Captain Quantum, Quark's dimensional counterpart, he admits that his past insistence, spawned from the hesitancy that fueled his refusal to continue looking for the lombaxes at the end of Into the Nexus, has changed. His time in Rivet's dimension, while it was admittedly an accident initially, made Ratchet grateful that said accident occurred and that Clank rebuilt the Dimensionator in the first place. Meeting Rivet and Kit was what refueled that initial desire he quelled. Ratchet may have once believed that, due to his past obsessions that consumed him, he was unworthy of finding the lombaxes due to the pain it caused him, and throughout the game, he even wondered if it was something that would have been worth pursuing again. But I suppose, in the end, he's been able to make peace with himself, and every fiber of his being knows that he's ready again to pursue that journey, and friends like Clank will be there to back him up. First things first though, they've got 2 Nefariouses to stop and a dimensional collapse to fix, and that Dimensionator makes Nefarious all the more deadly, even if Ratchet will have his advantage that he believes will aid him, which will cause Nefarious to inevitably figure out a means to gain additional advantages to stay steps ahead of the heroes. As they say about road tripping, rule number 1 is to always bring a map. Rivet and Kit, meanwhile, are also still in the fight, dealing with both Nefarious's possession of the Dimensionator in a home planet invasion, a situation that may be familiar to those who remember Supreme Executive Chairman Dreck's attempt on Veldin back in 2002, when Ratchet defended his home all those years ago. And it certainly won't be the last time we see this classic trope sneak its way into Rift Apart. But until then, they pondered together whether or not it was faith for the 2 of them to team up and fight the evils of their galaxy. And just as Ratchet and Clank had in their own dimension, things actually go very well on Sargasso, despite being accustomed to being alone. But inevitably, things are set in stone here to challenge the progress Rivet and Kit made together in their newfound partnership, especially when Kit discovered, after a small conversation with Rivet, that they met a long time ago, under the same circumstances that caused her to flee to Savali, with all of the guilt she internally held onto, as they are tied to the same incident. Both of them in their own way faced the difficult challenge of forgiveness and reconciliation. For Kit, it was believing in herself and forgiving herself for what she did to Rivet in the past, and for Rivet, it was forgiving Kit for what she did and healing from the painful trauma as a result of losing her arm. And this would be no easy and instantaneous road for either of them to travel on, as things are made clear when they return to Savali, which projects Rivet's recollection of the past through the phantom pain she still feels from that night, in addition to physically confronting another part of her past through a location she dreaded to revisit. But if there was any chance that her friends could be saved, or if they could still take on Nefarious together, she'd need to take those steps back to Zordum prison. The significance of these steps that take Rivet from landing on Zordum's surface to her friend's inevitable rescue. With the exception of rescuing Clank in the middle of the chaos, she's all alone. We've seen her alone in the game's opening, but this is probably one of the very few instances where she's back to where she started, mentally and physically, and her voice actress, Jennifer Hale, does a very convincing job of portraying that reluctance and sadness. Funnily enough, there's also a specific scene where, thanks to the effects of a laughing gas, Rivet sarcastically and hysterically expresses her frustrations of Kit and what she thought she really was, considering her to be a liar regarding their friendship. But as things are able to subside and Rivet finally has a one-on-one with Kit, that same theme I'd previously mentioned, discussing the Fixer on Torrent 4, reemerges, albeit in a very different way. Unlike Clank's firm belief that he's himself, and he considers himself to be fixed, despite the arm that he's missing, Kit is the opposite in this scene. All of the power she possesses as a warbot, that was built to be one of the deadliest weapons in the galaxy, makes her think of herself as a broken danger, who serves no purpose to anyone, not to the empire that created her to enforce Nefarious's law, or her destined lombax companion that she could save the universe with. That firm belief that she spews out, in addition to Rivet's proclamation that she doesn't need a partner anyway, is something that I think both parties end up regretting in that moment, only after they say it to one another. Regardless of if deep in their minds they wanted to team up and be heroes to the galaxy and friends to one another, I guess pushing each other away out of spite for both themselves and each other is the best they could do in that moment. It's only after they part that the seeds of healing can slowly begin to take shape in their minds to come together again. There are advocates and supporters for them both, like Ratchet, but it's still on Rivet and Kit's own terms if they want to unite as one again in the future, since that's all remains in front of them. One final stop. We've spent all this time fighting faction after faction, but with Nefarious threatening all of existence, the time has come for them all to come together to ensure that the universe doesn't get sucked into a formless void. It's a tiny bit cheesy, but it works, as we make one final stop back to where Rift Apart began, back to Megalopolis. Just make sure you got everything you need before the finale though. Final purchases, nefarious trooper and mech suit battles along with continuous dimensional chaos aside, something that admittedly gnawed at me regarding Emperor Nefarious ever since he flew into Zerky's arena to introduce himself comes to light here more so than before. I didn't know how to explain it properly until now, but he's got this I'm not owned, you're owned side that twitches every time his authority or presence is in immediate danger of being challenged. It happened when he took offense to Rivet rubbing it in his face that she won for once, and it was most apparent when Kit was gunning after him on Savali after she told Rivet the truth. Here in the final stages of the Megalopolis invasion, it becomes even more adamant. Like I discussed earlier with how Emperor Nefarious convinces his subjects, Dr. Nefarious included, that they are all nothing without him, he attempts the very same thing here as he yearns for a victory in a battle he doesn't realize he's already lost. Even if he's wrong, even if his foes have to spell it out for him that things have gone too far, he doesn't want to hear it, and he'll even go as far as to eradicate all of existence if his thirst to rule all dimensions cannot be quenched under his expectations. If he can't get the message by having the protagonist spell it out for him, then the only option left is to nail it into that thick mechanical skull of his, literally. To Rivet's luck, she was able to get some practice in fighting one Nefarious, and now she gets the opportunity to fight the Nefarious she knows, which, by the way, is a boss fight that got me amped up, especially with the music coursing through my screen as Kit battled Nefarious's troops, and Rivet took on the Emperor himself. It's almost as if the music itself is cheering Rivet and Kit as they work together again, rekindling the destined friendship and partnership they thought they could never reattain or maintain, like Ratchet and Clank did. Along with the music hyping me up from the beginning to the end of the fight, I also can't forget the hilarity and awkwardness near the end of the fight. My mind was bracing for something big to come out and take Nefarious's place momentarily, but like before in the beginning of the game, it was hilarious to just see Fish plop out instead. Though hastily returning to the hype, it was riveting, see what I did there? To have Rivet tell Emperor Nefarious, like Ratchet with Dr. Nefarious before, this is the part where you lose. Finally, after all those years of struggling against him, she got herself a win. And it's definitely a lot more satisfying to share said win with close friends and fellow heroes. It's safe to say also that this win also inspires both Rivet and Kit to continue upholding the responsibility of being heroes, and as long as they're together, they'll be ready for whatever the future has in store for each of them. Phew, that was pretty epic. But before I finish up here, there's tiny bits of material in the credits sequence that I'd love to briefly gloss over, though there are a lot of great moments here that fill my heart with joy. Captain Quantum and Captain Quark hanging out and doing hero poses. Something always told me that they'd get along somehow, and lo and behold, I guess Insomniac seemed to agree as well. Dr. Nefarious. He steps into Emperor Nefarious's office one last time before turning out the light, suggesting that he may be finished with his villainous streak, as he pays Lawrence along with his wife and child a visit. Will he be done his villainous streak forever? I guess that remains to be seen. Still, it's kinda nice to see Nefarious come this far, and see him genuinely care for the people who worked closely for him. For the first time since Into the Nexus' ending, Talwyn Apogee is finally back. She may not have been present during Rift Apart's story, but it's nice to know that she's still around. Maybe Talwyn will have an opportunity to meet Rivet and Kit? I mean, that'd be neat. Earlier in the game, it was mentioned by Gary that his father was actually the plumber. It kinda makes sense honestly, since he's always had this omnipresent vibe to him that you wouldn't expect, and yet he doesn't want to explicitly come off as someone who knows too much, though on occasion, he's let a thing or two slide, like when he jokingly said back in Ratchet Clank 2016, "See you in the next reboot." Last but not least, in addition to all that's been said about finding the lombax dimension throughout Rift Apart from beginning to end, I have a funny feeling that we haven't seen the last of our heroes again, and if they all do return, and assuming Insomniac Games is up for another one, then I'm looking forward to seeing what's next. Despite the major success that Ratchet & Clank has had in the past, and all the entries they were able to receive all these years, I was once again under the impression that if we got nothing after 2016, I was grateful of all the games we were able to get. But in this reality, since Rift Apart was a thing to come to fruition from Insomniac Games, they did a fantastic job on bringing the series back again. The game played exactly how I expect a Ratchet & Clank game to function, and gave me a lot more that I wasn't expecting mixed in with features offered this generation. And I never mentioned this while talking about Glitch, but it was especially satisfying and therapeutic to purge away virus nests while we're still caught in a pandemic. Makes me hope that one day we'll be able to do the same in real life, and declare this pandemic over. On top of the story being pretty solid, in my eyes, they did a great job of making it accessible to those who are brand new to the series, in addition to veterans who've played and loved this duo for years. It's really one of those things where I believe Insomniac Games was saying, if you're brand new, don't worry about it too much. Come for a ride in our game. But if you're a hardcore fan that's kept up all these years and have been waiting since Into the Nexus for a follow-up, thank you for joining us once more. Here are things that I'm sure you will appreciate. And as discussed throughout my review time and time again, that I have. And as for the characters, among the old and new crowd, there were plenty of memorable moments that I would love to go back to in future playthroughs, and will hold on to for years to come. This game was a big step up from Ratchet & Clank 2016, but I do however have one request that can fit both gameplay and character, if there is a next time. In a future game, should that come after Insomniac or finish other priority projects that are revealed to be in development, I would absolutely be livid if we have the option to play as either Mecha Kit or Clank next time. It's been a long time since we've seen that, so that'd absolutely be great. If any Insomniac employee happened to stumble upon my video and have gotten up to this point, then I just wanted to say, hi there. I hope you're having a great day. Thanks for making this game possible, and thank you for all the hard work you guys do, and have done, these past few generations. I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys continue to do next this generation. Other than that, that's about it. Not counting Black Ops Cold War, this was the first PlayStation 5 title that I reviewed, and I'm so glad I chose this one for my own content creator endeavors. I'm looking forward to eventually reviewing other titles for this console, be it ones that have been upgraded from last gen, or ones that are releasing brand new for the first time, the whole 9 yards. And 1 year after my initial purchase, I'd say I'm pretty happy with the console, and I believe it'll keep me entertained for years to come. On that note, we finally come to the end of the video. Thank you so much for tuning into this one. I was very excited for releasing this one. It would have come out much earlier, but due to, well, life happens, I guess. I had to push things with this and other projects, like my Jak 3 review, back, in addition to my Review Starlight review, as well as other projects that I still have in the works. Speaking of, that's what's next after this video. I'm excited for that video in a different way, since it's been a while since I've explored a new world, and an anime no less, through a video essay. But for this video and Rift Apart, it's nice to finally say, I'm done, baby. So if you want to check out any other videos like this, I have playlists in the description containing other long-form analysis videos, like this one. And if this video interested you enough and you want to continue to stick around for whatever I continue to do on my channel in the future, consider subscribing or pledging to be on my Patreon page at whatever tier you may feel comfortable with, though keep in mind, it is not mandatory to do so. It's just an extra means of support that will help me pump out videos and continue my YouTube endeavors more consistently, while I have another way to connect with my audience, while showing a bit more of my creative process firsthand. Anyway, once again everyone, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all next time. Take care of yourselves, and farewell.